What I try and do with a lot of my work, just in general, a quick overview of what I'm doing in terms of my PhD. I'm working predominantly on social housing. So this paper kind of feeds into like the greater framework of the work that I'm doing. I'm thinking about how do we think of ways in which we develop social houses by centering aspects of personhood, where personhood in the South African context happens to not center the Black body in a way which deals with the complexities that exist within Black or informal spaces. My paper is written in a way in which I first I engage with episodes and I explain space limitations within that episode for particularly Black bodies. Okay. Red, orange, green, an echoing sound alerting to stand away on the other side of the yellow line. Canned sardines in carriages, men and women dressed like school kids swinging to the pendulum. Train in motion, graveyard shifts complete. It halts. Women, men, children, no, mothers, fathers, daughters, and sons find empty spaces by shoving other a tad bit tighter than the last round of embarkment managed. Stifled in movement becomes my daily morning and afternoon. Red, orange, green. The traffic lights flicker as we meander between Adderley and Church streets. Tall buildings, moldings, design, art, color, hustle, and bustle, bricks, glazing, gutters, walls, concrete, steel, wet dew, face, breath, fresh air, shoe shine, S-curl. We are here to try again. Faranak historicizes contemporary urban development practices in Cape Town, rooting an argument in two historical periods, the British colonial era and the neoliberal post-apartheid South Africa. What creates an affinity between these periods is the making of an attachment to modernity or cityness, cultivated and salivating the practice of location creation for the native. Daily transitions between time and space are in dense contrast between endless self-dichotomy in constantly transmuting bodies. As Anya Roy offers, informality is not a separate sector, but rather a series of transactions that connect different economists to one another. In distinction to Roy, I propose a self-dichotomy here to refer to the duality of the dimensions of the experiences of informality and formality that visit at the sensory level that shape understandings of the power relations that may appear in an episode that are prescribed body experiences. My analytical approach is to look to experience as episodic. In every episode, an individual comes, in every episode, an individual encounters comes forms and relations of being both an insider and an outsider. Our view or orientation to the world is contaminated with these multiple concurrent locations. It is because of this that feelings of social exclusion are not necessarily always oppressive. Rather than different vertical layered strata, what I propose is a dendritic extension of self and relations with others that produce what urban identities and relations that I am calling survival mobilities. Here, survival does not denote physical, mental, and psychological health and wealth, but rather a pursuit to happiness, governed by outward measures of success within unrefined relations of power. According to Adam Blutzy, Black populations become aspatial. To be aspatial is not that Black people are not understood to be present in the space, but rather that it is the anti-Blackness of space, time, and power within making of space that renders Black people as ungeographic. Extending Catherine's notion of ungeographic, my understanding of ungeographic centers around structures of unbelonging. To be a constant migrant, again experiencing this through the senses, made a foreigner through taste, smell, and texture of spaces, that comes up with cultural forms, relations of intimacy, appropriated styles, and agency. It is the migrancy attached to Black labor identity, the complexities of family structure, daily routines, and how a particular group of people begin to understand themselves as a people. It becomes a site from which survival is understood to constitute urban identities, and from which people are compelled to become resourceful. While the city and its practices impose this ungeographic location, the hustle of Black work and life also reveals a diversity of urban worlds within cities. Along with the Black culture as a form of hustle that always moves ahead of progress or linear time. Dongela views the making of Black public sphere and Black modernities in South Africa as spectacular in their construction and theorizing attached to space, but reflexive and reflecting of transnational and Afro-diasporic work towards racial liberation. The shoe shine and the escal, the working of style as the making of knowledge, power, politics of Black time, that Alexander Waile would describe through the term sonic modernity, where the sonic remains an important zone from and through which to the fundamentally of Afro-diasporic formations to the current of Western modernity. Sonic Afro-modernity refuses to separate I am, I be in the interface of Black music and sound technologies. Horton Spirits introduces the intramural dynamics of alterity to speak of the interior as secret text or dialogue that characterizes Black public spheres. By interior, we mean, of course, that chain of intracommunal enactments, reenactments, and engagements yoking members of the same natal community. Methodologically, this implies for me a way of locating myself as a participant observer whose practice of being in the city also means to observe the ways that we behave towards each other. The way of thinking about existence is the work of radical love, perhaps in the ways that Nelson Torres described as decolonial attitude. Decolonial love is an element of a decolonial attitude. In Sandoval, it is the humanics of love, love for social change. Okay, I'm gonna go in, in a critique of urban renewal projects, Mpho Matiba describes regimes of representation, opting out of the usual habits of scholars in urban studies who trace a history of the city as one that begins in a post-colonial context, with the discovery of resources and the process of industrialization that reshapes the relation to land, economy, and citizenship. Matiba takes aim at other ways that marginalized or poor people still take up space, or rather the city. In part of her analysis, Matiba asked us to pay closer attention to the structural shape and conditions of the city, how we think about the ways that people such as Black women occupy space in the city and use public space. Matiba's entry is through women's businesses as hairdressers and a position as a customer of their services, and how in this setting, the setting becomes a scene around which negotiations of being are governed by sensory of Black time. That Black time is an elastic vessel carrying personal, communal, political, and historical narratives. That when time is used as a lens, artifacts, museums, buildings, roads, and sounds constitute the scene of subjection, voyeuristic fascination, and terror. In resistance to apartheid, Henry Mbaya takes on the voyeuristic fascination of the canning and sardining of Black people by inferring how the moral dilemma of handing out food parcels to the poor and brutalized, marginalized beings is a form of charity bordering on paternalism. That the fact of commiseration fails to robustly engage with the real issues. That it in fact palliates the conscience of the white college, functioning as a white institution responsive to white constituency. This being the patronization towards Black bodies who seek other forms of articulating intimacies within the world. Every street that is revisited by Black bodies still inhibits buildings that house ill repute. Black labor carries on a meager trade that sometimes leads to villainous chambers, doused with sly wings, and whispers of how spines were snapped, limbs were torn, as though picking petals of a sunflower. This is the Castle of Good Hope. Now, the Castle of Good Hope is a museum in South Africa, which is in Cape Town, which is considered a very beautiful city of South Africa. And it's a historical building that was built when Cape Town was still underwater. But what this building served to do during the apartheid regime was to basically capture slaves and basically torture Black people who were slaves, right? And so what I'm trying to illustrate by what I'm trying to illustrate in this scene is how we have this Castle of Good Hope as a museum in the middle of Cape Town, which reminds Black people of everything of what Blackness represented in that time. And we spend time in this Castle of Good Hope, not understanding the relations that this museum may still, the feelings and the senses that this museum might still have on a Black body. But it's there for white people to go in and be like, oh, wow, this is what we did to slaves. And that becomes like a very interesting way of how these modern cities work. Each brick laid in construct and form, side by side, until a determined measure follows mortar that binds the next generation of bricks to the previous. Also until a predetermined length. With every generation that is laid, compression and a deeper settling into the previous generation is witnessed. This process continues up until the desired measurement is reached and or until the point of fracture or shear failure. The steel columns and concrete beams cross spans. They are few in number, rise to great lengths, and with no generation compressing the other. The observation of architecture is plastered and painted, finishes with chandeliers dangling above marble floors. The irregularities of the bricks and structural integrity becomes mystical, even irrelevant. Histories housed in these buildings become empty voices with no integrity to halt moment and thoughts of injustice. People appear or meet each other across arenas of interaction, but it remains important to retain some attention to structural violence, described by Borghese as consisting of the devaluation, disposability, and dehumanization of populations as emanating from the everyday routinized practices of socioeconomic and political institutions. As Simonet notes, people and materials that operate within any space actively or potentially can step into and out of different senses of what is required and possible. Different performances and framing devices, different vertically layered strata of articulation, and different ways of being implicated in what is going on. That is, the representation of Black bodies in relation to both the materiality around themselves and the materialization of a cast of reconditioned governable subjects that adopt epistemologies, ideologies, representation techniques, tactics, instruments, and relations of the colonial period, for a people to exist absent of stimulated Black time. Salo's approach is to be attentive to time progression through the everyday activities, in particular place as a means to understand the complex negotiations of identity in space. Echoed in what Pieterse says, described as an approach committed to an ethical project of becoming and human flourishing. But Black time being an elastic vessel carrying multiplicities of life, form, and reproduction. That when time is used as a lens, kinship is more extensive than human form. It is more collected in oneself than described as an ecosystem. It is the freedom of freeing totems and bonding of elements not predisposed for oppressive work and precarious existence. Wage labor remains one of the ways that proper citizenship or personhood is often understood as a post-apartheid employment-centered paradigm of social inclusion. It is the settlement of these forms of kinship in the modern world, a settlement understood by dominant groups claiming ignorance, yet ornamenting primitive living conditions. Centuries buried, equating Black life and truth as primitive, stripped from the idea of modern yet. Vegans, soil toilers, mountain hikers, yoga participants housed in stone walls with streams running in their gardens, feeding tree trunks and herbal medicine becomes a new modern elite aspiration. The violence of knowing but unknowing is gestured towards progress, emancipation, and freedom. However, colonial work ethics presides over realities of insecurity, poverty, racial abuse, and coercive control. Buildings are torched, vandalized, run down, broken bricks turned to sand as bodies turned to ash, bodies torched, violated, run down, memories of every compressed layers, a revealing unearthing shake of frozen tongues, rebuked by the tiling and aluminium panel sheets. Salvage the material, we can rebuild the structure. Becky sees where Peterson calls Upanda to make life, where hustling becomes the instituting of a defense space, emerging defensive strategies that can be adopted by the wretched of the earth. Uzodinma's book of Beast of No Nation provides context to the defensive space by drawing parallels between the child and the nation, innocence, and an intangible psychological engagement with the inner beast, unconditioned by human socialization, but rather survival. How the introduction of the beast becomes the interface of knowledge and unleashing of spiritual totems. She describes knowledge as not, first of all, a mental event of cognition, but the event of pre-existing set of cultural parameters into which the body is inserted and with which it is in dialogue. Knowledge is, first of all, the body, or rather the body in relation to context. The body acquires knowledge of itself through mimetic engagements with its culture. Such mimetic acts unfold a perpetual reworking and renewal of pre-existing patternings. Out of the perpetual renewal, the body composes its own motile narrative, which allows it to interact or dialogue with the world as an agent in and out of history. In the first instance, then, we do not know the body. Rather, the body is what allows us to know. In her article, Knowing from Loss, Danai Mopota speaks to the recollection of knowledge by the body through cultural practices that call for spiritual anointment. That her act of pouring libation and the toi toi hereby described by Vianney Pambo as umzabalazo, the spoiling of the body, describes the multi-metaphysical dimension, African bodies, protest, resistance, and opposition, where the destruction of buildings may appear in human form, or coming for their modern city, and there is nothing humans can do about it. COVID-19 wasn't just a mere warning. Red, orange, green, and echoing sound, alerting to stand away, and on the other side of the yellow line. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to present. I'm going to read my paper, but also I'm going to present you because just to follow. Yeah, you can see it now, right? Thank you. Well, yes. Well, the cultural dimension of popular urbanization, which call popular urban culture, is found, sorry, my dog, is found in what Bonaventura de Sousa Santos names outside the line of visibility of abysmal thought. In this way, the inhabitants' knowledge, ways of thinking, imagine, representing, and intervene in their homes and neighborhoods are declared non-existent. The tequio, or faena, has been linked to popular urbanization as it has functioned to organize land occupation, subdivision, intervention, and urbanization of traditional neighborhoods and colonias populares in Mexican cities. The knowledge of this system was transmitted between peers to other members of the community and the younger generation. Likewise, tequio also represents another form of social organization and hints at an alternative way of representing and intervening in the world. Tequio is the name given to communal work in some regions of southeastern Mexico, mainly Oaxaca. It is an institute communal work system based on cooperation, reciprocity, and interdependence, whose origins are found in different cultures of pre-Columbian America. In Peru, it is known as the Minga, and in Ecuador as the Chunga. In Mesoamerica, this institution had different forms. Within the Nahuatl culture, it is known as Tecuitl. In the Mayan tradition is the task, faena, or fajina. Historically, diverse communities from these regions have transformed their environment. However, it is not just a form of work. It is an institution and a system that operates on 3 levels. It copes with the lack of community resources. It creates ties between members of the community at different scales, and ritual activities are carried out that promote community relations and work. The first axis mentioned is the one that organizes the practice and concrete objectives of the community work. Through the organizations around the needs of the community, works are organized that seek to improve their conditions. Roads, schools, markets, irrigation canals, etc. have been built from this organization. From ancient America to the present day, when this system continues to operate. The second level is that of the institution and cooperation strategies at different scales. Here, the social relations within the communal work system are organized through kinship and compadrazgo, as well as reciprocity and mutual help between members of the community when necessary. Finally, there is the symbolic component, which serves to reinforce both relationships within the community and to encourage communal work. This organization system propose a pre-modern value system that predates capitalism. First, at the center of the system is the community, which is contrasted with the individualism that characterizes capitalism. Along with this is the place occupied by the land and the territory of the community. Hence, work is so important, particularly that which has to do with land such as agriculture, plowing, excavation, road buildings, building construction, etc. In this way, the work service is one of the great virtues that the community praises, since it supposes a joint daily subsistence, where the preservation and development of the group is the long-term objective. Other values that make up the Tequio system are those of reciprocity and cooperation. This establishes a way of relating thought, a communal commitment, where those who receive help should correspond with a similar quality of and time, when each one in their opportunity demands it. Of course, this is preceded by a trust established between the individuals who provide their work service, their help on behalf of others, and in the community as a vigilant of commitment among its members. For although in theory, communal work has been free and voluntary since pre-Hispanic times, but here has always been a moral pressure within communities that make it impossible or revokes the refusal to carry out community work obligations. On the other hand, this work exchange reveals the existence of non-mercantile relationships between the communities, as well as the permanence of the use value over the exchange value. Some specific studies have argued that when monetary exchange that replaces work begins, the sense of community erodes. However, we should not idealize the Tequio or think of it as a timeless, immobile, or historical institution. Recent studies have indicated that Tequio has also functioned as a forced labor system from colonial times to the present day, where the pre-Hispanic communal system was supplanted by a hierarchy based on race. In this way, the groups in power used Tequio as a tool of domination that contributed to plunging the indigenous communities of the Mexican territory into history through misery and inequality. The manipulation of Tequio and community discourse by elites and groups in power reached new dimensions during the 20th century. During the post-revolution, it was violently linked to communal work and urban development for the construction of roads, dams, and railway lines. At the same time, the scale of community discourse was expanded to the new revolutionary state, which was supposed to incorporate the masses into progress and national modernity. But above all, it became a survival tool for rural migrant communities in the 20th century, who moved and adapt the Tequio system or equivalents to transform their environment into their new place of residence and or strength relationships with their community. Well, in the 1970s, the city became a mass phenomenon and began the period known as the massive invasions in Latin America, with the occupation and urbanization of large areas of Mexico City, such as Pedregal de Santo Domingo or Campamentos de Octubre, popular neighborhoods. Some authors recognize that this type of urbanization predominates in the physical form of more than 60% of Mexican cities. However, the popular urban culture does not usually systematize its technical knowledge, nor it is found in the study programs of universities and within the institutional visions of some government agencies. It was a problem to control. Community urbanization processes have taken place in some traditional neighborhoods and colonias populares with little or no support from the state. In this process, they incorporate their knowledge and technical resources and may or may not be advised by professionals in architecture and urban planning. The TECIO is one of the organizational systems with which similarities can be established in some processes of popular community urbanization. In these cases, the communities have reproduced or adapted some working days to occupy and or urbanize their territory in different regions of the country. Some elements of these institutions and their equivalents can be identified in different cases of popular neighborhoods in Mexico City. The Campamento 2 de Octubre neighborhood is located in Iztacalco, east of Mexico City. This was urbanized between 1968 and 1976 through the illegal occupation of the land in what is known as one of the great invasions of Latin America. Before the first paracaidistas arrived, the terrain was surrounded by a zone of chinampas around the La Viga Canal. The ground was muddy and difficult to urbanize. About 300 people came to that place in 1973, and more house applicants joined. The future neighbors came from the city center or other states. According to their testimonies from the first days, they arrived organized. Thanks to their leader, Francisco de la Cruz, they knew the dynamics to follow. They had to mark their terrain with chalk, cordon it off, and mark the limits with sticks to indicate that this piece belonged to them. From there, they began a process of community urbanization and joint resistance to the state. They also established different forms of cooperation. According to the neighbors, women were the group that narrowed the most at the beginning of the land occupation process. The women of the community organized themselves to watch over the chozas, which is what they called to their cardboard houses, take care of the children, and prepare food for the women and men who worked. The testimony of one of the first inhabitants summed this up as follows: people are very supportive. These people who are coming now do not lose that mystique of companionship, solidarity, volunteer work, without the intention of expecting anything. An example of determination and organization for self-construction were the inhabitants of the Campamento 2 de Octubre, who developed projects such as the foundation of a self-managed and community tabiquera, a partition factory, for the construction of many of the houses in the incipient neighborhood. According to its first inhabitants, they worked for a common good, which was the community they had formed due to the common territory, the need for housing, their class consciousness, and the confrontation with the authorities. El Pedregal de Santo Domingo is a popular neighborhood that bases its history on the legend of being the largest invasion in Latin America in the year of 1971. The land that today forms the neighborhood was covered in volcanic lava, next to the campus central of the National Autonomous University of Mexico to the south of the Mexican capital. There hundreds of families gradually occupied the area until it became one of the largest and densest colonies or neighborhoods in Mexico City. There was also a collective and cooperative urbanization process. The construction of each street of approximately 3 kilometers each required 800 collective tasks or faenas, about 120 people. These tasks were recurrent and were the work that each family provided to the community, is the take, through a relationship of reciprocity deployed in the territory. There, the inhabitants organized to dynamite the rock, dig septic tanks, and kill animals such as scorpions and snakes to establish themselves. Another important element to trace the cultural tradition of tequio present in the popular urbanizations of various neighborhoods in Mexico City is the neighborhood festivals or parties. In the traditional system, one of the most characteristic aspects of tequio was its ritual components, which contribute to uniting the ties between the members of the communities. Various classical anthropological studies have highlighted these virtues. Such is the case of the works of Robert Redfield or Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, who pointed out that communal work was done with encouragement, and that when it was completed, it was followed by a party that reinforced solidarity within the community. This is what the inhabitants of the Campamento 2 de Octubre talk about their urbanization process when they refer to, "I did not get to eat at my house anymore because they always offered me food and I accepted because I lived with the male and female companions." Also, in their spare time, they shared their hobbies and political concerns, which led to establishing relationships of trust. This is how a group of men from El Campamento 2 de Octubre mentioned it. Some was always playing the guitar with protest music. They were always talking about worker problems. They also shared imaginations of future, dreams, and individual and collective aspirations, such as the full urbanization of the colony and its regularization. Just for some conclusions, it is worth mentioning that this type of settlement continues to persist and reproduce to this day in the urban periphery in Mexico City and other growing Mexican cities. From the popular neighborhoods or called colonias populares. In this sense, the experience emanating from the process of popular urbanization will give rise to the lived space, which according to Henri Lefebvre is the space of the one who lives, where new special possibilities of reality arise. This is where their knowledge and practices come together to transform their environment, based on their experience of inhabiting their place. This way of making city from below, from the experience of inhabiting, has the power of another possible city, that of collective creation. Thank you very much.
Inside view of the field research for my PhD thesis. I have already finished yet. And yeah, and today I want to talk especially about the question, in which way do these urban agroecological initiatives contribute to creating spaces of buen vivir in the city by connecting between the city and the countryside. And my research is based on field research between 2014 and 2017, 18 months in total. I was in Bogota. And first I will give a little insight in the theoretical background about urban political ecology and decolonial views, and then take from that theoretical background the conceptual tools to analyze the coloniality of city space in Bogota, and then give you the panorama of the urban agroecological movements in Bogota and how they trying to resist and decolonize city space from below, and then go back to in the conclusion to the question in which way do these initiatives stand for spaces for Boer and Revier in the city. Political ecology was a lot of influenced from scientists from Latin America, but not only. It's on the one hand a critical analysis tool for analyzing socio-ecological conflicts, but also gives political perspective. It's apart from a criticism on the coloniality of knowledge, that the colonial expansion and expansion of capitalism went hand in hand with the universalization of Western or modern rationality as unique episteme. And Enrique Lev, also a point of departure for the political ecology, says that the differentiation between nature and culture was one of the ontological foundation of this modern thought, but it's not only a separation of two spheres of nature and culture, but also a hierarchization. One sphere is more valued than the other. And the geographer Walter Porto Gonçalves from Brazil applies this also on the differentiation between urbanity and rurality. He says that with colonialism, especially in Latin America, city was always associated as a symbol for civilization and for progress, whereas the countryside was associated with backwardness. And so this has both temporal and also spatial meanings, that going from countryside, migrating from countryside to the city, was associated with progress. And it's very interesting also to see how nature is conceptualized in political ecology as social product, as a product of social relationships. So Hector Alimonda says in his thesis about the coloniality of nature that unequal colonial power relations are reflected in landscapes. And so from this point of view, they criticize the perception of nature in modern thought as something separated from society. And nature in this view is perceived as something wild, as something pure and virgin, or it's getting commercialized as commodity within the capitalist organization of human-nature relationships. And on the other hand, they're trying to put forward perspective of Boer and Revier to overcome these dichotomies and see nature, humans, and cosmovisions as something connected. And so the political perspective for political ecology is there's the focus on environmental justice, to search for the just distribution of environmental risk and resources like healthy food. And also they highlight the environmentalism of the poor, which says that from contexts where people are most affected by environmental damages, there's where the strongest resistance movements arise. And I have here also an example from Bogota, the big waste deposit Doña Juana, which is in the southern part of Bogota, where all the poorer, lower class neighborhoods are situated and are most affected by the smell and all the outcome of the waste deposit. But here's also where the strongest resistance movements and civil society initiatives are located. So here there's also for a democratization and participation in the social production of the urban landscapes. And with this little insight in the political ecology, I go now to my case, the city in Bogota, and to show how in this case, colonial power relations are reflected and materialized in the city space. And to show this, I have brought some historic maps, as I am geographer. And on the one hand, we see here in the middle of the city that the important colonial powers in the Spanish colonialization had always were centered in the central place, in the plaza, with the church, the court, and the local government. But not only that, that's very typical for like all Latin American, or the most of Latin American cities. But we see also the invisibilization of nature, because Bogota is very characteristic, the eastern hills, the big eastern green hills called Cerros Orientales. But as Stephanie Galini and Castro Osoria say here, from a perspective of environmental history, in the bourgeois and therefore modern capitalist city, the Cerros Orientales seem to dissolve naturally into the city that controls them. So also here this image of nature, a society controlling nature. And there we see also continuity in the 50s. Here's a map from the famous architect Le Corbusier. And here nature is delimited to really define green spots within the city, also like showing this kind of control and nature something different. And we see here also that view on nature that I have presented at the beginning, seeing nature as something wild, or also rurality as a danger. And in Bogota, we see this with the displacement of the farmers' markets, which traditionally were in the center of the city and getting more and more displaced also by the solutions to the outer parts of the city. And nowadays the biggest distribution point of this kind of goods, it's in Kennedy, it's in the southern part of Bogota, Corabastos, and it's also one of the most dangerous places in the city. And this is explained because rurality was associated with chaos and with insecurity and non-hygienic situations. And we see an example also for the perception of nature as something pure and virgin, like the Cerros Orientales, the eastern hills I have explained, were declared reservation in the 17th. And so from then on, living there and also agriculture was prohibited, but there were already communities living in these hills. They were illegalized, and practically many of them had to leave or were displaced. And so there were a lot of struggles also from the communities to resist and search for their right to stay there in that place. And the fifth element, nature as commodity, we see especially in the peri-urban space, in the surrounding area of Bogota, where there are huge, big expansion and land grabbing for the flower agro-industry for exportation. In that the flowers are like designed for different countries where they are to be exported, like Japan, USA, and Europe. And there's also, we see here how nature is produced by unequal power relation, because also the water and the fertile soil is used for the exportation and for the export economy. And so there are like examples here for the colonial and neo-colonial continuity of neo-colonial production of the urban and peri-urban space. And what I want to show now is how the initiatives of urban agriculture try to make resistance against these tendencies. And the urban agriculture movement in Bogota is characterized by a great diversity diversity in searching for little spaces to make gardening, community gardening projects, and also biodiversity in seeds, like we see in this picture, native seeds of beans and of Andine legumes, like, I think there's no translation here, cubius and chacha frutos, you see in the picture above. And what is agroecology? Is scientific concept, agriculture practice, and also political movements which search for a more sustainable way to organize agriculture. And it's based on a dialogue of knowledge forms and a dialogue between the scientific knowledge about agriculture and the knowledge which comes from the very practices of peasants and indigenous communities. And it was always linked to social movements like La Via Campesina, and in Bogota there's a movement from the southern parts of the city, the Red Agroecológica del Sur, and in my view also an example for that so-called environmentalism of the poor, which states Martinez Allier at the beginning. And here in this map I show you where I was, the garden project which were included in my field research. I have to say that there are many more, but here's some of the points where I have was for workshops and interviews, especially in the southern and western part of the city, and also in the surrounding area, the so-called Sabana de Bogota, in the time between 2014 and 2017. And so now with that field research, I'm now, it's the base for the analysis now, in which way do these initiatives contribute or resist the colonial production of city space. And on the one hand, we see that in a very material way, that people appropriating abundant spaces in the city and use them for community gardening projects, a process what I've called spatial empowerment. And here we see also the visibility of rural practices like planting food in public space is contributing to a higher visibility and acknowledgement of these practices. And here there's an interesting connection also to the former speech about the tequio. In Colombia, they are called mingas, that kind of community work. And in the picture below, you see the network for food sovereignty. I was accompanying during my field research in that kind of minga or tequio. And it's also kind of solidarity work between the different peri-urban gardens to collaborate between the groups, and also practice came from the countryside to the city with the migration. And this practice contributes also to a higher attachment to the territory, especially for the migrant or displaced people by civil war in Colombia, because by the practice of gardening, they get more connection to the new territory, and on the same hand, making a connection with their past and in the countryside. And most of them came from agriculture. And this is, and the decolonial connotation, this is also expressed in the naming of the gardenings. And a very good example is the garden Techutiva, the garden project in the southern district, Kennedy. Kennedy is the name now. It was renamed after the visit of the President John F. Kennedy in Bogota in the 60s. And the former name was Techutiva. And so the garden project names itself Techutiva as a kind of territorial reappropriation of that space with that indigenous name, which was Guardian of Water. And another way how they're trying to push forward a kind of resistance is by reconnecting the countryside in the city by building up alternative food networks and by this linking producers from the countryside to consumers or people in the city, like with the network AgroSolidaria. Already since 8 years, they are distributing vegetable boxes from their cooperatives, from peasant and indigenous cooperatives to different points in the city, and also by establishing new agroecological farmers markets. And a very characteristic example to connect city and countryside is in the southern part of Bogota, Usme, where for example, the urban gardening project Aula Ambiental Agroecológica is a point where they try to organize youth collectives from the lower class neighborhoods of Usme with rural organizations, also trying to make resistance against mega infrastructure projects, like we see here one, where they really reach to stop the building of a new highway, which was stopped there, we see in the picture. And so they're organized, there are different agroecological organizations, also Sembradoras de Identidad, which trying to defend their territory for food production against mega infrastructure projects, and also are engaged in political spaces to define about the borderline between city and countryside, and to which line urbanization is possible. And also to that the colonial interventions have an epistemic connotation, especially in the case of seeds, like points of departure for gardening. And here's women engaged in the network Guardian de Semillas, guardians of seeds, of native seeds. And for her, she's from the Cauca, southern peasant region of Bogota, and also have brought her knowledge from that region to the city, and now giving workshops about seed reproduction. And it was like her education, which she said in the quotation, which she brought from the countryside to the city. So in the urban garden projects, this kind of knowledge, which comes from the very practices also, it's getting more visibility, and it's getting exchanged and more acknowledged. And so the seeds also, like that knowledge about the seeds, it's shared like a kind of commons, but it's always also contested, because the restriction with the free trade agreements restricted the free use and free exchange of native seeds. And so it's kind of an epistemic disobedience to continue with that kind of exchange points or events in the urban gardening projects. So going back to the question, in which way do these initiatives constitute spaces for buen vivir? We see that from a point of view of agroecology, nature is viewed as a commons, as a shared socio-ecological space in which natural processes and human practices can coexist harmonically, like in a kind of convivencia, in a harmonious coexistence. And that, especially in the case of Bogota, we see that from this movement goes, there are arising different kind of resistances against the neo-colonial productions of space, and they're trying to build little seeds of buen vivir in the gardens, where they're searching or trying to realize just society-nature relations. So it says on the one side, it contributes to a decolonization of city space by reappropriating territories for community garden projects, for rural practices like food production, and by giving them native names. And has also a dimension of epistemic empowerment, as they constitute spaces for a dialogue of knowledge forms, where the peace and knowledge gets more visibility and acknowledgement. But on the other hand, these spaces are always contested, and always there's a continuous threat of an enclosure of the commons, by processes of gentrification or new infrastructure projects, or also by cooptation of the kind of native knowledge forms. They're trying to commercialize peri-urban space and nature. So these spaces are always contested. And thank you for your attention.